The phone lit the room like a confession booth, every buzz a tiny hammer striking the same bruise on a heartbeat that had forgotten how to trust itself. The apartment smelled like rain and takeout soy sauce. A true crime doc murmured from the TV, the narrator's slow baritone cutting through the white noise as Lily's sleeping body curved into the couch with an innocence that made everything I was seeing feel impossible. Her hair spilled across the throw pillow like spilled ink, breath slow, even, serene, while the screen kept lighting with Snapchat previews from a name I didn't recognize, Ryan, each notification a tiny betrayal wrapped in neon. "Thanks for covering the hotel bill," one preview said. "Can't wait for next weekend. You're amazing, baby." The words didn't land all at once. They unspooled, pressurized, their meaning densening the air until I had to swallow just to breathe through it. I didn't move for a full minute, then another, listening to rain tapping the glass, the radiator ticking, Lily's breath, these ordinary sounds that had soundtracked our life, suddenly foreign, like a soundtrack I hadn't agreed to. The narrator on TV said something about motive, then silence, and I realized I was holding my breath like someone waiting to be caught doing the right thing. I picked up the phone. The passcode was the same 4 digits she'd used for everything, socks, drawer, trust, dressed up as intimacy, and the dam burst into messages, photos, and a timelined rewrite of months I thought were hours. Ryan was her ex. The thread made that clear with shorthand only history can manufacture, the kind that doesn't bother explaining itself because it assumes it will always be understood. Weekends I thought she'd been doing open houses back-to-back were dotted with selfies at hotels I could practically smell, the crisp, chemically neutral sheets, the too cold AC, the filtered morning light angling through blackout curtains like a blade. There was more, there was always more than anyone expects when the word cheating first sits down in the room. Venmo screenshots, my name, my notes, my rent help and car repair, and don't stress. I've got you payments bloomed into proof of purchase for their dinners and overnight stays, a ledger of my generosity itemized into someone else's intimacy. And then, because rot never confines itself neatly to one wall, there was a separate thread with a guy named Jake from her gym, the tone flirty, cynical, like she was trying to convince herself she believed the person she was performing. "He's so eager to help," she'd written. "I just mention money stress and he practically throws his wallet at me." She'd screenshotted messages I'd sent, the careful ones, the small kindnesses, the got home, and you ate right, and laid them out for a laugh track that only she and whoever was on the other end could hear. I scrolled until my hands shook, until my body felt 2 inches too small for itself, until the room had that underwater feeling where sound arrives late and light gets heavier. When I touched her shoulder, gentle, almost not wanting to wake her from the version of herself where this wasn't happening, she blinked, then squinted at the phone in my hand like it was rude, not catastrophic. "Marcus," she said, voice thick with sleep. I held the phone up between us, the screen open on a thread where she'd promised someone else the same weekend she'd promised me a Sunday morning farmer's market. Her face didn't crack. "It rearranged. You're going through my phone," she said, sitting up, pulling her knees under the blanket like armor. The doc on TV had moved on to a new suspect. The rain had softened into a hush that made the moment feel both smaller and enormous, like the end of a play in a very small theater. "We're just dating, Marcus, no honesty needed." She said it like a shrug she'd been rehearsing. The sentence landed and then kept falling, down past the floorboards, into a place I hadn't known was under this apartment and under me. "No honesty needed," she repeated, slower, as if this were self-evident, as if intimacy were a subscription tier I'd simply misunderstood. I heard myself laugh, one note, splintered, and then I stood because nothing else in my body knew what to do. "Pack your things," I said, quiet, because quiet was all I had left that belonged to me. The words felt like they were coming from far away, a mouth speaking on behalf of whatever backbone survives the first blast radius. She looked offended before she looked afraid, and both expressions fit her like outfits she'd worn before. "Marcus, don't be dramatic," she said, lowering her voice to something reasonable, soothing, professional, the tone she used on difficult clients when she was selling them square footage and good light. "It's not like we're married. I kept things flexible." Her hands drew a shape in the air as if the geometry of betrayal could be made elegant. The couch creaked when I stepped back, the floorboard near the bookshelf made its usual complaint, and I thought of the months I'd spent turning this place into a home she'd been happy to inhabit without ever entering. I saw her heels under the coffee table, the glossy brochures I'd designed for her listings stacked on the counter, my car keys in the bowl we'd bought together at a street fair where I'd kissed her under a string of lights and thought I was lucky. "You used me," I said, and my voice sounded like someone had sanded it. "You used my money to cheat on me." The sentence didn't feel indulgent or theatrical. It felt like a clean cut through a knot I'd spent months pretending could be undone if I just tried politely enough. She rolled her eyes, then caught herself, then tried on contrition like a new coat. "I was confused," she said. "Ryan, Jake, it was messy. I was figuring things out. Don't make this some morality play. We were casual. We said we weren't labeling it." She said labeling like a curse word. I thought of how she'd half moved in by week 12, how my weekends had rearranged themselves around her showings, how my brain had learned her coffee order the way hands learn a route in the dark. "Get your things," I repeated. Tonight, outside, a car passed, tires whispering on wet asphalt, and it felt obscene that the city was still doing its job. She stared at me long enough to call it patience, then went to the bedroom. I stood in the doorway and watched her pull clothes from drawers we'd pretended were ours. She took the heels and the silk blouse she said made her feel invincible and the little jade plant she'd never watered. She left 2 bobby pins on the bathroom sink and 1 silver ring on the mantel, small, glittering landmarks of a life suddenly in past tense. At the door, she turned. "You'll regret this," she said softly, like a blessing gone sideways. I didn't answer. When the door clicked shut, the apartment exhaled. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and let the room be quiet enough to hear the hum in the walls, some worker bee of a building doing what it does. In the silence, grief arrived, first as embarrassment, then as anger, then as a clarity that didn't feel triumphant so much as practical. The phone lay face down on the table. I turned it over one last time and scrolled to the message where she'd told Jake I was clingy, that I always want to know where I am, and that she could make him do anything with the right story. For the first time since she'd walked in 8 months ago and made the place feel like music, I wanted everything of her gone. I opened a blank note and wrote 3 lines: change locks, cancel shared gym membership, call therapist. When the list was done, I added 1 more line: tell the truth. The truth was that I had loved her in the way a careful person loves, tenderly, consistently, with a competence that could pass for boring until the day it becomes the only thing worth anything. The truth was that she had loved the way some people shop, trying things on in good light, never committing to the pieces that fit, blaming the mirror for what wouldn't change. The truth was that something in me had known, and that knowing would now become something else if I let it. I turned off the TV. The rain had stopped. The silence felt like a thin sheet pulled clean over a bed, cool, promising sleep I wouldn't get. The morning after broke like a dull blade, functional, unimaginative, sufficient for the work at hand. Light pooled on the hardwood, picking out the rectangle where her suitcase had been. The air held the faint smell of her shampoo, that grapefruit something that always felt like optimism in a bottle. I made coffee because surviving is often the most unpoetic thing in the room, and then I made calls because lists become doors when grief needs an exit. The locksmith came at noon, a man with a generous mustache and a vocabulary of reassuring clinks. He worked while I boxed the remnants she'd missed: 2 dresses, a stray charger, a tiny square of Polaroids where our heads leaned together like a secret we both believed in. I slid the photos into an envelope without looking too closely because some days bravery is just refusing to narrate the obvious. At 2, I canceled the gym membership that had sounded like a healthy habit when we signed it, a symbol of future selves carved out of sweat and repetition. The rep thanked me for my business with the bland cheer of someone who knows nothing about me, which was comforting in a way that felt impolite to enjoy. I wrote an email to my therapist and booked an extra session. The subject line read, "Immediate." By late afternoon, the apartment and I were getting reacquainted, 2 exes making small talk at a party neither of us wanted to attend. I wiped down the kitchen counters and found one of her earrings under the microwave. I ate toast for dinner because cooking felt like telling a story with a plot I didn't like. The quiet was less accusatory than the night before. The list on the counter had 3 lines crossed through and the last one glowing like a dare. Tell the truth. The truth asked for witnesses sometimes. I texted Bate, our mutual friend with a talent for seeing through people without making them feel flayed. "Need to talk," I wrote, and she responded with an address and a time because good friends often skip the ceremony. The bar was dark wood and brass and low light, the kind of place where breaches of contract have been confessed for 100 years. Bate arrived in a green sweater and a face set to listen. I told the story with fewer adjectives than the night deserved, letting the chronology carry the meaning like a solemn pallbearer. She said, "We're just dating. No honesty needed," I finished, and I watched anger flare in Bate's eyes like a match that knows what a wick is for. Of course she did, Bates said, not dismissive, just fluent in the language of people who believe flexibility means consequences don't apply. I'm sorry, Marcus. She put a hand on my wrist, and I let the touch anchor me the way a small weight anchors a balloon to the table. We sat a long time, the space between sentences filling with the clink of glassware and an old song that had been playing in every bar in the world since before we were born. Back home, the night was thinner, like a wound that had stopped bleeding and started knitting. I opened my laptop to send invoices I'd been avoiding, work stepping in with its clean edges and the relief of solvable problems. I was in the middle of resizing a brochure layout I designed for one of Lily's luxury listings when I remembered, with a small jolt, that I didn't owe her anything anymore. I closed the file. It felt like closing a door with a quiet latch. Sleep came in jump cuts, a hotel hallway I did not walk down, a text preview I could not unread, Lily's voice saying, "No honesty needed," with a calm that felt like a dare. In the morning, therapy began the way most repair jobs do, with inventory. "Where did you first learn that love is earned by effort?" she asked, pen slow, gaze steady. "At home," I said, surprising myself with the speed of it. My father tightened bolts for a living and tightened his feelings because he believed they would rattle loose if he didn't. My mother made room for everybody and left herself at the door because she thought that's what hospitality meant. I learned that showing up was the point and that asking to be seen was the part that made you difficult. We talked about boundaries like they were furniture I could arrange differently if I wanted the room to feel like somewhere I lived, not somewhere I apologized for entering. We talked about people-pleasing not as kindness but as control with pretty manners. "If you can make everyone comfortable, you never have to risk being yourself," she said, and I felt something give way inside me, like old plaster finally letting go of its dust. Days began to stack, imperfect and earnest, the way sober days do after a long season of pretending. I hiked a ridge trail on a Sunday and let my legs become proof that I still belonged to a body. I made a pasta sauce from scratch and ate it in a bowl that suddenly looked like it belonged to a person who would not be auditioned for their own life. Weeks later, Lily tried to circle back the way some storms do, soft at the edges, no lightning, just a widening gray that suggests weather. Since I'd blocked her, she used email, long, winding paragraphs about growth and owning my part and not being ready for real love, a phrase that begged for sympathy without ever kneeling before the specific. She referenced God, therapy, fate, and the baby she said had given her perspective, all nouns enlisted for the kind of absolution she hadn't earned. I didn't respond. Silence did the work speeches pretend to. She escalated to proxies, friends who said she just needed closure, a colleague who called my office with worry in her voice that didn't belong to her. When Lily started showing up at my gym, timing her entrances to coincide with mine, I changed my schedule and let the staff handle the policy side of boundaries. The day she called my workplace posing as family emergency, my boss pulled me out of a client meeting with a face that made my stomach ache. I dialed the number and heard Lily's voice, stripped now of even the courtesy of plausible deniability. "Please don't hang up," she said, and I realized this was no longer a breakup story. It was a story about whether I believed my life was mine. "I won't meet," I said. "I wish you well. Do not contact me again." It was not heroic. It was adequate, which is a kind of heroism that never trends. When I hung up, my hands shook not with fear but with a current I recognized as returning electricity. Something had shifted. I had not forgiven her. I had not achieved enlightenment. But I had chosen myself with a consistency I used to reserve for other people. It felt like the beginning of something that didn't need a name to be real. Healing, it turns out, is less like a sunrise and more like learning the light switch locations in a new house at 3 a.m. You bump into things, you curse in whispers, and then, suddenly, your hand remembers where the wall knows you are. I set gentle rules: get outside daily, no coffee after 2, text a friend before the mind makes enemies out of furniture. I went back to the climbing gym where problem-solving comes color-coded and falling is rehearsed. Work thickened, inquiries piling, a new client in hospitality wanting a rebrand that felt like sun-warmed stone and cedar, a language I spoke fluently. At a kickoff meeting, a project manager named Naomi laughed at a joke I didn't know I'd made and later sent a playlist that turned my commute into a mild epiphany. We started walking after work, not dates, just shared air and small talk that kept veering into big talk and back again. "I don't do performative vulnerability," she said one evening, watching the river take light apart and put it back together. "I either tell the truth or I shut up." It sounded like a boundary and a gift wrapped in the same sentence. I told her softly about Lily, not the gore, just the outline, and she nodded like a person who knew where not to touch a bruise. Meanwhile, Bait called with updates I didn't ask for but couldn't ignore. "You won't believe it," she said, voice teetering between compassion and the human temptation to assign meaning to mess. Lily's license had been suspended. There were ethics violations. There was a pregnancy with a man whose vows to someone else were louder than any apology he might have owed her. It painted a picture of a life collapsing not out of spite from the universe but from physics. Structures fail where supports are imagined and not built. I didn't gloat, I couldn't. Pity isn't a virtue, but it can sometimes be a sign that the fire is out. The emails continued, this time compositions of spiritual epiphany, her finding God as if God were a lock screen pattern she'd finally guessed. The detail that never appeared was the one that would have made any of it mean anything. "I lied, I stole, I hurt you on purpose because it served me." Naomi asked gently if I'd consider blocking her from my work email and reporting further contact. "You can be kind without being accessible," she said, and the sentence sat down beside me like a friend with good posture. I told HR, and the next interruption came with a new shape: absence. On a Saturday in late spring, Naomi and I hiked the ridge I'd done alone after the breakup. The trail was the same, but I wasn't, which felt like a fair compromise. At the overlook, wind shouldered our jackets and made conversation unnecessary. Back at the car, she handed me a thermos of tea and said, "I like your quiet better than most people's noise," and I felt something inside me choose to stay. Lily found new angles, a mutual acquaintance accidentally forwarding me a post about missing real love, a cousin of hers liking my photos with a frequency that said, "See me seeing you." I did not respond. Some silences grow flowers if you water them with patience. Then came the text that pulled the thread I'd hoped had been tied off. Ashley, a real estate colleague of Lily's, wrote, "She's at the diner on 12th every morning before her shift. She wants to apologize, she's different now." The message was bait wrapped in pity. I stared at it long enough to feel both noble and petty, then wrote, "I'm glad she's safe. Please don't relay messages again." Boundaries felt less like walls now and more like clarity drawn in chalk that rain couldn't quite erase. But the world is not a retreat, it's a city. I ran into Lily at the grocery store on a Tuesday, both of us holding baskets we pretended were shields. She was visibly pregnant, in leggings and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back, face free of the performative shine I used to mistake for radiance. For a half-second, my body remembered everything: her laugh in my kitchen, the way she'd fold herself into my side when commercials got too loud. "Marcus," she said, and my name sounded like it was being returned after being borrowed too long. "Please," just that one word, given a job too big for it. We stood between cereal and soup like people cast wrong in a scene they couldn't leave. "I wish you well," I said, and meant it the way a person can mean something that costs them nothing because they've already paid. She nodded, eyes shiny, and for a second I saw the girl I'd fallen for, the storyteller who could turn a security deposit into a heist film. Then I remembered the screenshots, the ring on my mantle she hadn't bothered to ask about, the sentence "no honesty needed," spoken like weather, and the empathy receded to a humane distance. At home, I texted Naomi, ran into a ghost, still alive. She replied with a heart, and then, "Dinner, my place, I make a mean risotto." I said yes, not as a replacement part, but as a vote for the road with streetlights. That night, while chopping shallots in a kitchen that smelled like patience and butter, my phone lit with an unknown number. I let it ring. I didn't need to ask who. Some lessons are learned when you stop picking up. Summer came like forgiveness no one owed me, long evenings that stretched like cats in windows. Work steadied. My bank account stopped performing rescue missions on behalf of other people's emergencies. Naomi and I practiced a new kind of closeness, the kind that asks, "What do you want?" and then waits like the answer isn't a test. We moved slow on purpose. She taught me that desire isn't a siren that has to be outsmarted, but a chime you can choose to hear or not. I told her that I still woke sometimes with a heart sprinting toward a door that wasn't on fire. She nodded and turned the pillow to the cool side and said, "That makes sense," the way a person says. The forecast said rain, and packs an umbrella instead of writing a think piece about clouds. Then Bait called with a voice like the edge of a paper. "Heads up," she said. "Lily's telling people you abused her financially, controlled her money, kept her dependent. She's spinning the story. It's getting ugly." The words were a map of a war I didn't want to fight because I had already left the battlefield. "Do you want me to say something?" Bait asked. I sat with the question until sitting felt like action. My instinct was to produce receipts, not metaphorical, literal, transfers, dates, screenshots of her messages, and the hotel bills my kindness had footed. But then I pictured Naomi's face when she said, "You can be kind without being accessible," and I realized that public vindication is often a currency that never converts to peace. Instead, I called a lawyer not to sue but to ask how to keep my name mine. We drafted a simple, clean cease and desist, and Bate got quiet when I told her because it's stunning how boring survival can be when it's done right. "Proud of you," she said, "not for fighting, for choosing the fight you can leave." The letter did its work or she ran out of audience. Either way, the noise receded. The gym stopped mentioning her. The inbox went still. I kept therapy because maintenance is sexier than repair, and nobody tells you that until you've done both. One evening, Naomi and I watched a storm wet the city. The windows rattled, the living room dimmed, and she said, "What do you want your life to feel like? Not look like, feel like." The answer arrived before I could pretend it was complicated, like I'm telling the truth in it. We made small plans with the ease of people who had stopped auditioning. A weekend at the coast, a dinner with friends where nobody asked me to translate my pain into a lesson, a savings goal that looked like a future and not a bruise. My phone stayed face down and silent because silence now meant simply peace. On a late August morning, a message slid into my work email with a subject line that made my chest cave slightly. "Please." It was Lily. The body of the email was long enough to be a memoir and vague enough to be a horoscope. She had found God again, lost him, found him. She had discovered in suffering the outlines of a better person whose face looked a lot like mine, if only I would hold up the mirror. "I know I don't deserve anything," she wrote, "but losing you made me realize I was living wrong. I'm in therapy. I'm changing. I want my child to know what real love looks like. I want that to be us." I read it twice, not for meaning but for muscle memory. My body knew where the bait was even when the words were rearranged. Nowhere did she write, "I lied." Nowhere, "I stole your money to fund my cheating." Nowhere, "I treated you like a tool and called it romance." The email apologized for an abstraction, not being ready for real love, the way a politician apologizes to anyone who was hurt, which is to say to nobody. I typed 3 sentences and then deleted them because sometimes grace is a blank page. I set up a filter to route anything from her to an archive with a name that made me laugh: compost. Some things rot into soil you can grow a life in. Some things just rot. A week later, Naomi found the ring on my mantle, the little silver circle Lily had left like a punchline. "Want to keep it?" she asked, neutral as a weather report. I said no. We took it to a shop that buys metals and used the cash on a plant for the living room and 2 concert tickets for a band we both loved because transmutation is the oldest magic we have. At the show, lights rose and fell and the crowd sang like a single lung. I closed my eyes and thought, this is a life that doesn't require me to translate myself for entry. When the encore ended, my phone buzzed once more, a message from Bate. "Proud of you." Also, Ryan told Jake everything. They both dumped her months back. She's back at her parents', working at a diner. I stared at the text and felt nothing accusatory, nothing righteous, just the quiet fact of consequence at work, physics doing what it does when support beams are made of wishes. Outside, the air was cool and smelled like rain that hadn't decided yet. Naomi took my hand. "Hungry?" she asked. I nodded and we walked toward a neon sign that promised noodles and delivered. Grief has a half-life, so does anger. What lasts, if tended correctly, is discernment, the click of a lock that fits the key it was made for, the pleasure of a no that requires no justification. Fall slid into the city with a soft insistence. Leaves gathered in corners like quiet conspiracies. I woke without dread most mornings, which felt like a luxury I'd stopped believing in. Naomi met my sister. My sister texted me after. "She's kind in the same places you are, which means she won't punish you for it." We celebrated with cheap champagne and a pizza that dripped sincerity. On Sundays, I called my parents and let my dad tell me about a bolt he couldn't loosen and how he finally did. Lefty Lucy has never been about bolts. Then one afternoon, the past tried one more door. The front desk rang. "There's someone here asking for you, says it's urgent, says she's family." My skin remembered the emergency call that wasn't. My chest tightened like a fist. I went down because avoidance is not the same as peace. She stood there smaller than I remembered, belly round under a thrifted coat, hands wrapped around nothing like they were practicing. The lobby made everything feel official: marble floors, the kind of lighting that tells the truth about faces. Marcus, she said, please, 5 minutes, I swear. Boundaries are not walls, they are doors with rules. Here, I said, nodding to a bench near the window where the doorman could hear every word. She sat carefully like a person negotiating with her own body. I'm sorry, she said, and for the first time the word looked like it had been carried, not just worn. She told a story I already knew in outline. Ryan gone, Jake gone, the license suspended, the diner, the parents' house, a man whose ring on someone else's hand had silenced entire chapters. I was wrong, she said, eyes on the marble, voice small. I hurt you because it was easier than learning how to be a person who doesn't use people. I told myself we were just dating, so I didn't owe you honesty. That was a lie I liked because it let me get what I wanted. The specifics landed like rain finding the right roof. I used your money, she said. I used your kindness. I made fun of you to make myself feel like I wasn't the kind of person who needed saving. I was. A tear slid down and she let it. I don't want you back, she said quickly, as if reading my flinch. I want you to know I know what I did, and I'm sorry, not because I lost you and my life collapsed, because it was wrong when it happened. There it was, the sentence receipts could never buy. Something in me unlocked that wasn't a door, it was a window. Thank you, I said, and the words didn't feel cheap. I accept your apology, I don't want contact beyond this. She nodded, relief and grief sharing a chair. I'm trying, she said, not to be better for someone else, just better. She stood like standing was a decision. Take care of yourself, she said. You too, I said, and meant it with the clean simplicity of a closed book on a tidy shelf. Naomi listened that night without offering architecture for my feelings. I'm proud of the way you stayed with yourself, she said, and the sentence felt like a ribbon cutting for a building I now owned free and clear. We cooked, we ate, we didn't make the moment bigger or smaller than it was. The past didn't knock the next day, or the next. The resolution arrived not like a thunderclap, but like the first clean breath after leaving a building with bad air. Months had passed, winter made the city glassy and honest. The mornings were narrow and bright. Naomi and I signed a lease together, 2 names under a sentence we both meant. We will take care of this space and each other. We moved boxes, laughed at the archaeology of our old lives, ticket stubs, a chipped mug, a shirt that still smelled like a concert where the lights had felt like mercy. In the new place, I hung a small frame over the desk, white paper, black ink, 4 words, tell the truth, Marcus. The intention that once made me vulnerable, the desire to build a home, to show up, to love with competence, had met its obstacle and learned how to keep itself intact without becoming hard. That was the climax, not revenge, not vindication shouted into an empty hallway, but the quiet, astonishing endurance of a self that did not abandon itself to be loved. On a Sunday, we drove to the coast where the ocean does the world's most convincing impression of infinity. Wind peeled at our jackets, gulls performed their low comedy. Somewhere a child laughed at something that had nothing to do with me, which felt like proof the universe wasn't all allegory. We walked until conversation wasn't necessary and then kept walking. I thought of Lily briefly, not as a villain or a lesson, but as a person I had loved and then refused to keep loving because the price was me. I hoped her child would learn honesty the way my hands had learned these hands again. I hoped she would find rooms where her stories didn't have to be performances to be believed. Then I let the thought be carried off by the wind, which was doing a terrific job. Back home, we ate soup that steamed our faces and watched a movie that asked nothing of us. I sent Bate a photo of the new plant thriving near the window. She replied with a thumbs up and a "your life looks like you," which might be the only compliment worth framing. My phone was quiet in the way a phone can be when it is no longer a door propped open by other people's emergencies. In bed, Naomi traced a small circle on my wrist, the human version of a dimmer switch. You good? She asked. Yeah, I said, and the word was a room with lights on and no one hiding in any corner. I fell asleep before the credits finished, a luxury I had earned with every no that made space for this yes. The resolution was simple and it was everything. I kept my intention to love honestly and found a life where the primary obstacle, dishonesty dressed as modern flexibility, no longer lived in the same house as me. The climax wasn't an explosion, it was a vow whispered to the only person who had to hear it. Do not abandon yourself again, the rest will be weather. Abandon yourself again, the rest will be weather.